So now we're going to take a look at the actual Bush presidency. So Bush goes ahead and takes office. He received 271 electoral votes to win the election, but took only 47.9% of the popular vote, with Gore taking 48.4%. Still, very close margin between the two. Really less than a full percentage point between the two candidates. Really about, well, literally 0.5% separated them in the popular vote. But it was what it was. Bush won the Electoral College, so Bush takes the office. But of course, you still have a lot of people feeling like Bush stole the election, and it really becomes kind of a lose-lose proposition, because had things come out the other way, with Gore being declared the winner, undoubtedly, roughly about half the people that voted would have felt that Gore had stole the election. So this creates a very difficult situation. People were concerned. Bush certainly lacked a clear mandate to govern, and a lot of times people talk about that, but that's, once again, the expressed will of the voters, and certainly Bush lacked that, as less than half the people that voted had voted for him. And so there was a great deal of concern over whether or not Bush would be able to govern effectively, given that fact that the country was so divided by the election. Ultimately, things didn't prove to be too bad. Once again, as we mentioned with the dot-coms, early into Bush's first term, several dot-coms, or internet-based businesses, began to fail, and the economy slipped into a recession. To stimulate the economy, Bush pushed for tax cuts. The cuts, combined with increased government spending, though, turned what had been a budget surplus left behind by Bill Clinton. In other words, when Bill Clinton left the White House, we were running budget surpluses. The government was actually spending less money than it was taking in. But rapidly, we shifted back into deficit spending. We began to spend more money than we were taking in. And like I said, a couple of effects, a couple of things there. We've increased government spending. At the same time, we're decreasing government revenue by cutting taxes, hoping that stimulates the economy. Another thing that Bush pushed for when he got in was his education reform, known as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, as it's sometimes been referred to as the acronym. Bush's plan for improving our schools becomes known as No Child Left Behind, and it required schools to have highly qualified teachers in every classroom. The program, though, was widely criticized by educators for creating unfunded mandates, and also along with a whole system of ranking schools and requiring mandated testing to rank these schools, which has, of course, become very controversial as well. Many critics feel like we're well over-tested, but it doesn't seem like it's going away. On the domestic scene, Bush wanted to reform Medicare, and he pushed through a bill to add prescription drug benefits to Medicare. A series of corporate scandals led Congress to tighten accounting regulations and increase penalties for dishonest corporate executives, and Bush also pushed for strategic defense programs as a part of restoring the military. Then, fairly early into Bush's first term, we hit the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. So on the morning of September 11th, terrorists hijacked 4 planes. 2 planes were crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. 1 plane was crashed into the Pentagon, and a 4th plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania when the passengers tried to retake the plane, which prevented it from actually hitting its intended target. All in all, 2,973 victims died in the attacks, plus all 19 hijackers that were involved. Of course, the attacks has quite an impact on the United States and actually on the world. It really changes the way in which we look at things. Most Americans, when they look for an event to compare this to, there was a strong tendency to try to compare the September 11th attacks to Pearl Harbor. It was probably the closest thing in terms of the shock value and the loss of life. But in many ways, this was even more shocking, partially because this wasn't directed at our military, but this was directed at civilians. And when this happens, this was really televised live. Few people saw the first plane hit, but many Americans, myself included, were watching the news and actually saw the second plane hit the second tower, and then watched the towers collapse, and began to see the events of that day unfold on live television. And it really gave us a whole new way of looking at the world. And obviously, as a natural consequence, we want to hold the parties that are responsible, we want to hold them responsible for their actions. But it becomes particularly difficult in the case of the September 11th attacks because, unlike Pearl Harbor, where we were attacked by a country, Japan, we know who the enemy is, we know who to go after. But in the case of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, the attack was carried out by a terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda. Soon after the attacks, Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, claimed credit for the attacks, and he became really our most wanted. The problem is, once again, is that fighting against something like terror, which is an ideology, is particularly difficult to fight against. And even a group like Al-Qaeda, you can take out Osama bin Laden, but he's the head of the organization, but more heads may pop up. And that's really kind of been the case. It took us 10 years roughly to track down and to kill Osama bin Laden, but there are still members of Al-Qaeda out there. There are new leaders that are rising up. So we still have a terrorist threat. This hasn't gone away, sadly. Al-Qaeda, as we mentioned, did have training camps in Afghanistan. So the U.S. demanded that the Taliban, which was the ruling government there, hand over Osama bin Laden to the United States. They refused, so we went in with our forces and toppled the Taliban. We helped set up a new government there with Hamid Karzai as the new leader, and then we have stayed there, and still to this day we still have troops fighting over there, fighting against remnants of the Taliban and remnants of Al-Qaeda that are hiding out in the Hindu Kush mountain range along the border with Pakistan. And so we continue to fight them there. And as we mentioned, we did eventually capture Osama bin Laden, but it took us a long time. Now, looking at modern terrorism, most terrorism directed at the U.S. today comes from Islamic fundamentalists, although we have had some incidents of domestic terrorism, like the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. And the primary issues that have turned many Middle Eastern groups against the United States is, one, Western influence in the Middle East, and two, the United States' support of Israel. We also have developed a problem known as state-sponsored terrorism, and that's basically where a government sponsors acts of terror. Libya, Syria, and Iraq have all been nations that were known to have sponsored terrorist activity. In Libya, a revolution that started in 2011 rather. In Libya, a revolution that started in 2011 toppled Muammar Gaddafi, their longtime ruler. He had been clearly a sponsor of acts of terror, including being the sponsor of the bombing of flight Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. But Syria, their government still is believed to engage in acts of terror. Currently, there's a civil war going on in Syria as well. And both the government and the rebels have group ties to terrorist organizations, which is a particular concern for the United States. The government's linked to Hezbollah, a terrorist group out of the Middle East that usually targets Israel, while the rebels seem to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda. That remains a big concern. Iraq, well, the government there was under Saddam Hussein who was believed to be a sponsor of terror. Of course, we end up going after them, and Saddam Hussein is no longer the ruler. And this brings us now to Bush's axis of evil speech. So Bush made reference to an axis of evil or rogue nations that supported terrorism and or are seeking weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. And he mentioned specifically Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as nations that made up this axis of evil. And of course, we ended up going to war in Iraq, and we still have tense relations with Iran. Sanctions have been in place for a long time. We've recently begun negotiations with them to try to get them to curb their nuclear program. North Korea, we know they have nuclear weapons. They remain a big concern. They're a big threat, not so much to the United States, even though their new leader, Kim Jong-un, has threatened the United States, threatened to use nuclear weapons against us. Nobody really takes him seriously. He's been likened to a barking dog locked inside a car with rolled up windows. Not really much of a threat. But nonetheless, he remains a big threat to a couple U.S. allies, particularly South Korea, which they share a border and previously been at war with, and also with Japan, who is a strong U.S. ally. So North Korea remains kind of on our radar.